Well, let's do the quick intro here. President of the United States, Trump, seems to be taking the coronavirus pandemic as an opportunity to strive for new lows. He reportedly offered the German firm CureVac $1 billion to hand the U.S. exclusive rights to a potential COVID vaccine. This is the height of capitalist hubris, if you ask me. This would, of course, limit access to vulnerable people all over the world. If you are feeling sick to your stomach now, don't panic. Those aren't symptoms of the coronavirus. They're symptoms of having a totally incompetent, self-centered, and egomaniacal president. Professor Wolff is here to give us his take on this story and, all the other ones that are coming down the pike. And we're going to have to do it fast, I guess, because you're a busy and high demand. What do you make of Trump's offer to the German scientists for a large sum of money for exclusive rights to the coronavirus vaccine?
Well, I think for me, it was a jaw-dropping moment. I could not believe, and boy, I'm ready to believe virtually anything about Mr. Trump, but this was, as you rightly put it, a stunning new low. Let me go over it very briefly. Early in March, a meeting is held apparently at the White House with Mr. Trump, Mr. Pence, and several other of the highest ranking officials we have, with the American CEO of a German company that is apparently well along in the process of developing a vaccine against the coronavirus that we're all terrified by. The offer, if the New York Times and the Die Zeit German newspaper that broke the story a few days ago, if they're to be believed, and the story has now been replicated by several other prestigious national and international news sources, the Trump administration, through the CEO, who's an American citizen, even though the company is based in Germany, they offered him, as you said, $1 billion. That's the money that was reported, basically to buy the company so as to secure the vaccine for Americans, for the U.S., either before or instead of other people in other countries. The notion that you are going to save some people with a vaccine while you let other people who are denied that vaccine to die, it left me breathless.
America first, Professor.
Well, America first is one thing. America live, others die, that's a whole nother level. And it led me to ask the following question, and I don't mean to be funny. Who are the Nazis now? Notice the Germans said no. Angela Merkel and other officials blocked the sale. If the company was even considering it, the German government said, no way, no one is going to have exclusive access, not Germans, not Americans, nobody. If there's a vaccine, everything will be done to produce it everywhere for availability everywhere. And since the United States has shown itself to be stunningly unprepared, so that most Americans can't even get a test for the virus at this point, putting something as urgent as a vaccine in the hands of a demonstratedly incompetent, not government, not Americans, would be nobody, a criminal act. And to the credit of the Germans, they prevented it.
That's a great question. Who are the Nazis now? Now, President Trump and the head of that company both deny that this happened, but we have someone who is involved in the conversation. That's the news story, that there is someone who is involved and saw the conversation, that it was true. And I tend to lean toward, of course they're going to deny it. They probably didn't know what they were doing was wrong. And that's the problem with the mindset up on Capitol Hill at this point. They're looking for how to make money off of people's death, which is not so shocking given our healthcare system that we have right now. But when it's laid bare in front of the people in that kind of way. It just seems
And
like
something,
too far.
there's another dimension to this. Mr. Trump's nationalism, his turning away from international relationships in a kind of know-nothing inwardness and insulting German leaders, European leaders, Chinese leaders, you name it. He has also created the conditions where the German government, which might have kept quiet about having squashed all of this, they made the decision at the highest levels, Minister of Health, those people do not speak unless the German government says so. They exposed it to their own media. That's because of the collapse of relationships between Germany and the United States, which were initiated and pursued in the most arrogant way by Mr. Trump. We're not getting international cooperation anymore. And now he has seen that when you do that, that particular act will come back to haunt you. And now the German government has exposed him, and he has had to be forced into lying about it. And now they will expose that he's lying about. This is the deterioration of the global arrangements, which mean that getting together to solve this crisis of the virus isn't happening. And now you saw another example of the breakdown of international relationships just at a time when what we need is the opposite.
I heard Trump bragging about how him stopping travel to and from China was his big accomplishment, that otherwise we'd all be dead by now. It's just insane, the lengths that this guy will go to defend his incompetence. It's shocking.
Absolutely. Look, he blamed the problems of the American people on immigrants. Then he blamed the problems of the American people on Canadian and Mexican trade relationships. Then he blamed it on China. This is a man who's turning every problem this country has into a foreign event, blaming the foreigner. And now it's with the virus. It's just the crudest form of hoping that you can ride the nationalism, anti-foreigner horse into office and to stay in office on that. It is the crudest attempt to save capitalism by means of a hyper-nationalism. Again, making one wonder who's the Nazi now.
Professor Wolff, turning to the 3,000 point market drop of yesterday, on top of the, 2,000 the day before and another couple of thousand before that. Can we talk about what does this mean to the American economy in general? And then, it would be nice to kind of peer into the future and get a sense of what kind of solutions we might be able to apply. I feel very hopeful that people are finally going to be like, hey, we might need Medicare for all, and universal basic income might be a good idea. I feel like it's possible that this pandemic could lead us, to something that might be a more just world. I don't know. I'm trying to hold out hope here, Professor Wolff.
All right. I will try as hard as I can not to convert laughter into tears.
No,
here.
that's fine. Go ahead. It's not going to be good.
And I share your hope that out of all of this chaotic mismanagement, lack of preparedness, some kind of epiphany will happen, some moment of understanding in which a significant portion of the American people will understand that the economic system we inherited through no fault of our own, a capitalist system, is now collapsing, and that we have the ability to do better. We have the ability to go forward. The slave systems of the past eventually collapsed. The feudal systems of the past eventually collapsed. We all knew somewhere that the current one, capitalism, would eventually collapse. What we're learning is we might be in the middle of it. So let me answer your question.
Yikes.
The stock market has collapsed with a speed that nobody foresaw. Thousands and thousands of points, if you add up the last 10 days, are stunning. Even more stunning, a week ago, the Federal Reserve dropped the interest rates by 0.5 point to prevent this from happening. Not only was that effort a failure, but the very drop in the interest point was interpreted by most investors as a sign that our problems were more serious than our leaders had led us to understand, which we now know was true. It provoked the panic, made it worse rather than solving it. Therefore, on Sunday, this last Sunday, the Federal Reserve, having not learned the lesson, did it again. Only it didn't drop the interest rate 0.5 point, it dropped it an entire point. That is unprecedented, okay? And they pumped in hundreds of billions of dollars more on top of the new money they had pumped in the previous 10 days, which were also records. And on Monday, the day after they did that, the stock market again dropped, only by even more, as if to mock the efforts of the government, of the Federal Reserve, of the banking system to cope. Okay, one has to understand why. We are now telling restaurants, gatherings, conferences, events, sports, the Big East, all the biggest events of the sporting season, all of these things are being canceled. Hotels, therefore, will not be full. Airplanes are moving empty or being canceled. As you close the economy down, tens of millions of people are not being paid their wages. Let's understand, the restaurant that closes isn't going to pay the waitresses. They're not going to get their tips. The people who wash the dishes aren't doing anything, and there's nowhere else to go to get a job because all the jobs are being closed down, meaning that the ratio between the people looking desperately for some income and the jobs for them to have is collapsing around us. And it's promising to be that way for weeks or months. Nobody, no economist, myself included, can get their head around how bad this can get, how far this can go. And let me give you just one big dimension. We are now a capitalism that solved its earlier problems, particularly the crash of 2008 and 9, by going into levels of debt we have never seen before in capitalism's history. The debt of the United States government is at record levels. The debts of corporate America, businesses, are at record levels. And the debts of the people are at record levels when you add the 4 basic kinds of debt Americans carry: mortgage debt for their home, car loan for their automobile, credit card for their daily expenses, and the student loans that without which kids can't go to college. You put all that together, and here's what you got: a population losing its income in a restaurant, in a hotel, in an airline, in a factory that closes or shuts down. Those people and those businesses cannot pay their debts. They will not, at the end of March, be able to send that check or pay that debt bill. What happens to the banking sector when all of those outstanding loans can't get paid back? This is the question no one knows the answer to. So what you have is a cataclysm economically, and a government which actually has various mechanisms available to it to deal with this problem, but is so incompetent and, more importantly, ideologically blocked. The government is run by Republicans, and the worst among them, who believe, they really do, that the capitalist private sector is the magic solution for everything, and the government is a big burden. They're not the people you want at a time when the only thing left that can save this capitalist system is a government that supersedes everything else and makes happen what has to happen. Jobs, incomes, because the private sector has broken down. Capitalism is disintegrating as we speak.
So we didn't even have to elect Bernie Sanders. It happened without him on its own accord, right?
Yeah, unless the people who run this society, the very people who brought you Donald Trump on the Republican side and who've been working overtime to get the namby-pamby, dead, old Democratic establishment into power through Joseph Biden, as long as those people with their history and their incompetence and their ideological blinders run the show, we will have breakdowns of this sort. And if it isn't, by the way, a virus, it'll be something else. Don't forget that about a week ago, a tiny number of capitalists and the governments they put in power got together and collapsed the price of oil. That could have sparked all of these things also. And again, a simple example. In this country, we have let the banks loan hundreds of billions of dollars to a small number of companies that are doing what's called fracking, mostly in the Midwest, from Canada in the north to Texas in the south. They're doing fracking to bring up oil. They hoped to do it at a profit. They convinced the banks it would be a big profit. With the collapse of the oil prices, engineered by Saudi Arabia and Russia, those fracking companies are bankrupt. They can't bring that oil to the surface and make a profit with the price down as it now is. And that means they cannot repay the banks who lent them the money to put those wells in the ground. And that undermines the banking system as drastically as what has happened so far. When you have a fragile capitalist system breathing on the respirator we call debt, almost anything can be that final straw that breaks the camel's back. And that's where we are. And if we don't act nationally very quickly, this is going to be the beginning, this conversation, of a long, bad slide. And I salute you for trying to keep some distance, some perspective, some comedy. We badly need it. But I can't answer your question, if I'm going to be honest, any other way.
No, we don't want you to do the comedy. We want you to do the educating. And then Leighann and I will do the comedy.
All right.
After you leave.
Well, given my lack of comedic skills, it better be you, because it's not going to be me.
You are watching act.tv's coverage of the coronavirus, both here on Twitch, and also we're live streaming on Facebook. So if you have a question in either area, please put it in the chat. I am watching all kinds of chats, and I see a couple of questions coming in. So we're going to start peppering Professor Wolff with your questions after Leighann and I are done peppering him with our questions. Leighann, did you have a question?
No, I'm just going to fangirl for a minute, because Professor, you said you're not funny, and I listen to your podcast. I love it. It's one of my top favorites. And your timing and your sarcasm that you mix in your education is, I love it. So please don't undersell yourself.
Don't exactly.
That is very sweet and kind, and I am much obliged for your saying so.
Over to what is happening in Spain. I understand they are nationalizing their hospitals. Your take on this?
Yeah, again, my fear is only that it's too late. There have been half a dozen studies by the American Hospital Association The United States has been closing hospitals, particularly in rural areas and in poor neighborhoods in urban areas. And the reason is our capitalist medical system. Hospitals that rely on either old people covered by Medicare or poor people covered by Medicaid are reimbursed by the government at a very low rate, and they can't really keep the hospitals going. What that does, of course, is push patients into the private hospitals, into the hospitals where the rates are higher and where therefore they can afford to charge people who are covered by insurance because they're not poor people, etc. You get this story. It is, again, the same system. We have to understand that we are held hostage in the United States by a private, profit-driven capitalist medical industrial complex. Four industries got together: doctors, hospitals, drug and device makers, and the medical insurance people. They got together, support each other, and that's why we end up in this country not only paying more for medical care than any other advanced country, and no other country is even close to what we are required to pay, but also profit means hospitals have been closing. It doesn't pay.
Oh, yeah, Bloomberg, right here in New York City. Bloomberg
Absolutely.
closed how many hospitals? 10?
Yep. All kinds, and particularly in poorer areas. So what we have is a decision, a profit-driven decision. Doesn't pay to have all these hospital beds. Yeah, it doesn't pay this year, and it may not even pay next year. But if we have a coronavirus, we will pay with our lives for not doing it. If you use a profit calculus, you do what the United States did, and you end up unprepared. If you use a public service-driven policy, which is what the Spanish government now late decided to do, then at least you're using your head. We need beds for any eventuality, even if they sit empty for a year or two. That's what we owe ourselves. We know what viruses can do. We've known it for 100 years. It's the capitalist profit motive that led us to make decisions that leave us unprepared now.
I wonder if the government will go back and throw the people who are now living in high-priced condos that were once hospitals until Bloomberg closed them out and, take the hospital space back. That would be nice.
I live, Julianna, just a footnote. I live 3 blocks from what once was St. Vincent's Hospital in the Greenwich Village area of New York City. That hospital, which I took my own family members to when they needed emergency attention, and I was grateful for the work that the doctors and nurses there did, that is gone. And in its place is an extremely expensive condo project that is closed off to the public, has internal gardens and so forth and all. So we have gotten rid of the beds we need for the people in order to create luxury apartments for the people who need it least. It is a stunning example in my little neighborhood, this little corner of the United States, of what we see now writ large across the country as a whole. And it would be a tragedy if we don't learn the lesson that a medical system that we rely on literally for life and death can be allowed to be subordinated to profit calculations of shareholders. It is immoral as well as economically self-destructive.
Professor Wolff, I have questions about the Yellow Vest movement in France and other questions about this on a larger scale. But the questions that are coming in from the chats are things like, what do we do right now? How can we, not to use the word capitalize, on this moment in order to create a more just society? And, in that same vein, should we all run to the bank and take out our money? Those are the questions that are coming in. People want personal direction and also sort of a societal, your thoughts on things that society could do.
My answer is the one I usually give, and it usually leaves people frustrated, but I really can't do better. And the Yellow Vests is the example. You have to get out in the street. You have to make it clear to the people that sit in the dominant positions in this society that there will be no more business as usual, because the way they've run the business as usual has run us into the ground. It's not acceptable. What's making the French and the Spanish governments jump is the mass anger of the people. For example, in France, but it's true in Spain too, the Podemos movement in Spain is a mass movement that gets people into the street and that threatens the power structure. In France, it was first the Yellow Vests over the last year and a half, and then it was the general strike that all the unions put together in the streets to let the president know he's not going to change the pension and take pensions away from people. If you don't do, by the way, when the people went into the streets, the tax on utilities that Mr. Macron, the president of France, had proposed was withdrawn. And when the people went into the streets to protest the pension, it was withdrawn. Now he's going to continue. He tries to bring it back. But that's where we are. We're in a fight between a dying government trying to hold on and the mass of people. But short of mass action, we're going to sit here depressed, isolated, quarantined, not just for our health, but for the political survival of a system whose time has come.
Well, that's another thought I have. We're not allowed to go in groups of 50 or more. How are we going to get out in the streets? It seems like a very convenient way to suppress dissent.
And you're going to have to face what it means. Look, human beings are very creative. If we can't get the thing spoken and said and shown one way, we'll do it another. What's needed, though, is the commitment and understanding that this isn't a little problem that's going to be solved by this adjustment or that act or this declaration or even that law. We have a system that has broken down for the mass of people. And the question is, what is that mass of people going to do? And the creativity we need is everybody. Rather than asking me or anybody else, I don't have that answer. I wish I did. I'm hoping some of your people who phone in questions or let you know will come up with the devices that will answer that question.
Well, we have a whole bunch of questions from James Woods. Do you see Trump's corporate approach to dealing with the corona, with Walmart and CVS being as the beginning of the push to privatize Medicare?
Absolutely. He's been interested in doing that, and the medical profession has been interested in doing that. They don't want anything to interfere with that. That's why they call every program socialism, as if that were some terrible bad word, which, by the way, Bernie has shown us millions of Americans are perfectly happy to vote for someone who's a socialist and doesn't run away from the name. I think the corporate approach of Mr. Trump is at its peak, and I think we're going to see a descent. I think the American people are about to turn on Mr. Trump, to blame him for the incapacity to deal. And the irony is, it's a much more systemic problem. It really isn't Mr. Trump. It's all the Republicans and the Democrats that went along with it that have for years developed this system that is breaking down. But it may well be that Mr. Trump gets blamed and that we have a surge now, like we did in the 1930s, that goes in the opposite direction. That we will have a New Deal, and it won't just be green, but it'll be doubly the intensity of the first one in the 1930s.
In the short term, Mitt Romney and some other leaders have recently come out in support of giving every American $1,000 to support them during this crisis. Is this a good idea in your estimation?
I think they're going to have to do something like that. Only $1,000 is a stupid joke. It shows the mentality of these people. I mean, it's beyond words. $1,000? That won't get you through next month's rent. Where's your food? Where's your clothing? Where's your transportation? Where are the most? I mean, it's a representation of the mentality of millionaires.
Oh, I know you're probably getting a lot of calls.
It's just coming. But only a millionaire or billionaire like Romney and the majority of the people in the Senate could come up with something so idiotic that it's embarrassing. If a student in my class said, in the face of this crisis, let's give everybody $1,000, the rest of the students would have to be holding back their laughter in order not to embarrass the poor person who didn't think the answer through. That's what I mean. We have a leadership that goes with a system. They've been running this system, and of course, they would imagine that $1,000 would make a difference. It's always the same with those people. They don't get it. And that's not because they're individually incapable. They're part of a culture. They've thought about things in ways that make this such a break from what they ever thought about before that they pat themselves on the back. Gee, we're giving people $1,000. Your economic system and your stock market just collapsed, taking from those people tens of thousands of dollars. You want to give them $1,000 back? What's the matter with you is the only response.
We have other questions coming in, and we're speaking with Professor Richard Wolff. You're watching ACT-TV's, I guess, live coverage, both on Twitch, chatting with our nice fellowship on Twitch that we have, and also we are simulcasting on Facebook, which I believe is not allowed by Twitch, but we'll see what happens.
It's wild times. It's wild times.
It's yes, wild times.
All the old rules are falling apart. That's what happens when empires die. That's what happens when systems fall apart. And you know, to give credit where it's due, the American people, they kind of know. Over the last 10 years, think how many movies have had a tsunami or a flood or an earthquake or monsters. We've kind of wanted to begin to play with the idea of being overwhelmed by something for which modern society isn't ready. In our fantasies, in our dreams, this is already happening. And that's a sign that we kind of half know in that partial way. You have an instinct that something is happening. And I think the American people kind of get it. Even reaching out to somebody as weird as Trump was a sign we need something different, even if it's crazy different, because we are not in normal times.
From our Facebook page, Gianna Bini Warchola says that perhaps we should suspend payments for essentials like mortgages, rent, loans, and utilities for the next 2 to 6 months. Your thoughts about that?
Yes, I think you're already seeing that. I believe the Italian government has suspended mortgage payments. You see, those governments are...
What about rent? If you have a mortgage, you already own your home. If you're renting...
Right. But it's the beginning of a recognition. That's worth a lot more than $1,000, right? The Italians are way ahead of Mitt Romney. That's a low bar, but nonetheless, you can see the situation. Yeah, you can suspend all kinds of payments, but you're now in a systemic problem. If you suspend those payments, then the banks who expect to get the mortgage check in the mail won't get it. And if the payments aren't made, they can't sustain the credit structure of this country, et cetera, et cetera. You have waited so long, you've let this crazy system function so long that it's become an interconnected kind of web. And you can't just play with one piece and imagine that the other parts aren't going to be affected. So if you're going to stop payments, what are you going to do? Look, in New York City now, the restaurants are all closed. Okay, what are you going to do with the tens of thousands of people whose income depended on that restaurant? That restaurant isn't going to pay the waitress, the people who clean the dishes, the people who maintain the restaurant. And what are they going to do? And how are they going to function? And you've closed the schools. So what happens to all the single mothers who are the responsible ones for their children? Have you taken care of that? No. You've closed the school, but you've done nothing to solve the problems created. That's when the system falls apart. When the solution to one problem makes another problem even worse than the one you just started with. It's out of control, and we have people in place who couldn't function in normal times, and they're useless as the system falls apart.
A question from our Twitch chat, Richard McSundy says, there's a lot of questions coming in. As an Italian and an anarchist, I've personally firsthand viewed, I guess, the curfew like measure the Italian state has put in place to combat the pandemic. I am not obviously speaking against quarantining people, but against the tools that my society has decided to enact, which go from social control through militarization of the streets, empowering the police force with control papers, which can cost you a felony, and new surveillance tools like drones, searching for abrasement of people. I think that the question cut off just a little bit, but
yeah, I
you
have
get where we're going here.
Yeah, this has to be the last one. I'm sorry, Julian. I'd be glad to come back on if we can arrange it.
Yes, I'm sorry too, because this is wonderful, and yes, we'll definitely.
Very quickly. I think your questioner there has a very good point. Look, this system is not going to go quietly. Systems rarely do. They're going to try to keep the lid on this situation. And the harder it falls apart, which is their fault, the harder they will try with repression, with police, with drones, you name it, to keep the lid on the system they have mismanaged into this disaster. That's right. And they will use the coronavirus to excuse anything and everything they do.
Yeah.
Having large numbers of prisoners in a single place, in a single jail, is a mechanism for spreading the virus. They haven't figured that out. Keeping immigrants in detention camps is a mechanism for spreading virus. They haven't figured that out. They're going to be very tempted to be very repressive. That's part of what collapsing systems do. Anyway, I offer to come back. Your program is invaluable for getting these things out, and adding some humor to it is a real social service. So I take my hat off to you. And if you want me back, believe me, I'll be glad to come.
Oh, thank you so much, Professor Wolff. I appreciate it. And I'm sure you're going to be talking to people all day long. We'll be in touch about our next one. And again, you can follow Professor Wolff on Twitter at @RDWolff. Find his work at democracy@work.info. Right. I knew it was a weird one, but thank you so much for being with us. And thanks for the work that you do.
Thank you, Juliana, and good to meet you, Leighann, and thanks again for your kind words.